This is a video of the March 5th, 2022 meeting of the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities of the School of Spiritual Science in North America, and it's offered in two parts for ease of viewing. Part 1, under the sign Human, and Part 2, The Dark Forest. This is the complete 29-minute video of both parts, but you can also view Part 2, The Dark Forest, as a separate short video if you prefer. Okay, I'll start tonight's meeting with a few words from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke. I chose this quotation because I think it leads us directly into the theme for tonight's meeting and for the coming meetings this spring. The impulse to art is, after all, nothing but a perpetual inclination to balance the conflicts that endanger and strain our eye, ever newly formed from such diverse elements. Also, before I begin, I'd like to mention Jane Hippolito, because part 1 of this presentation this evening concerns an artist that Jane talked about quite often in our section meetings in Fair Oaks over the years, Alexey Javlinsky. I have very fond memories of Jane passing out postcards of Javlinsky's art. Javlinsky is featured in the recent year-end issue of the magazine Stil that appeared around Christmas 2021. I'll be talking about that issue tonight and sharing some information about Javlinsky. Presently, Stil is only available in German, although efforts are underway to offer it in English. The topic for this meeting and a few other meetings this spring is art and theory of art. Now, we should keep in mind that from the broader perspective of our section, when I say art and theory of art, I could also say poetry and theory of poetry. Speculation on the nature and function of poetry, after all, has been a central part of the Western conversation since Plato and Aristotle. There is a strong argument to be made that Plato should be considered the founder of what we now call literary criticism or critical theory, since, as we know, Plato called poetry into question and criticized its value and utility from the standpoint of philosophy. Speculation on the value and function of the visual arts has often followed from speculation on the value and function of poetry. In that regard, it is, I think, very significant that our section is now so closely aligned with the section for the visual arts and with the section for the performing arts. This is a sign of the times, in my opinion, for what it's worth. But it's also a sign of the times that our friend, the poet and artist William Blake, anticipated, as we have discussed quite often in previous meetings. So let's look at the recent issue of Stil. Here is the lead-off editorial for the issue with a picture of Ariane Eichenberg, PhD, who is the editor for the issue. Ariane works closely with Christiana Hyde, who, as you know, leads our section. Ariane tells us that she has a special interest in the theme conscience and memory. Oh, shades of Novalis, eh? As well as a special interest, along with Christiana Hyde, in how literature makes us human, or maybe another way to express that thought, literature and becoming human. And let's hold on to that idea for a minute. This theme, how does literature make us human, is an important one for our section. People might say, well, aren't we human already by virtue of birth with a human body? From, however, a spiritual scientific point of view, or maybe even you could say from the point of view of literature, one might well argue that this naive assumption is incorrect. We are not human by virtue of birth. We become human as a result of, well, that's what our section meetings are about, one might argue. How does literature, the reading, writing, the discussion, the teaching of literature, the enjoyment of literature, the fooling around with literature and with words, the telling of stories or reciting or writing poetry. How do these activities contribute to the spiritual path of becoming human? What do we mean by human? Such questions move us centrally into questions posed by Rudolf Steiner, of course. Thus, the title of the issue of Stil, Under the Sign Human. The title implies that perhaps a word that we take for granted and as self-evident, human, is not so self-evident or well understood after all. Now, let's hear what Ariana has to say in her editorial, which I've translated. Ariana begins with a quote by Kafka. Kafka says, "All the sufferings that surround us, we also must suffer. Christ suffered for humanity, but humanity must suffer for Christ. We all have not one body, but one growth, and that leads us through pain everywhere, whether in this form or in that. Just as the child develops through all stages of life to old age and death, so we develop, no less deeply connected with humanity than with ourselves, through all the sufferings of this world." Ariana writes, when Franz Kafka noted down this aphorism in 1917, he was seriously ill with pulmonary tuberculosis. Suffering, pain, and ultimately the knowledge of death thus became for him the starting point and prerequisite for his development. But in addition, Kafka recognized that through suffering, the individual human being is connected with Christ and the whole humanity. The suffering of others is my own, and my suffering is theirs. Now, right away, we, in the meeting here, hear echoes of themes that we are quite familiar with from our long studies of Novalis, do we not? Novalis lives very intimately with those who pose the question of the human, one might argue, especially in his close relationship to literature and the visual arts. Here, for example, is a well-known fragment by Novalis that we have looked at many times and which sounds just like the words of Kafka, quoted a moment ago. Many of the themes, actually, in fact, that we find in this issue of Stil are contained in these seed words of Novalis, and let me read them. "The heart is the key to the world and to life. One lives in this helpless situation in order to love, and to learn of one's dependency on others. Through imperfection, one becomes open to the influence of others, and this openness is just the point. In sickness, others can and should help us. So Christ, from this standpoint, is the key to the world." Okay, now let me read more of what Ariana wrote in her editorial. She says, "We live in a time of extreme suffering worldwide, in all places and every circumstance. To grasp and to take hold of such suffering and to own it personally is a daunting task. As individuals, we close ourselves off to such extended pain and suffering for fear of losing our personal individual identity in it. To look into the pain and the abyss exceeds our everyday consciousness. To pass through this trial of suffering exceeds our abilities. To do so requires trust and the knowledge that the human being is a citizen of two worlds, that she carries within herself the possibility of making our visible world transparent to a world invisible. What remains invisible to us in our conscious present moment, life, experience in sleep, and the realm of death, weaves a connecting lemniscate between the earthly human being and the cosmic human being." Ariana continues, "The contributions in this issue address these topics and themes in several ways, through architecture, philosophy, literature, and art. Some of these contributions originated at the Pentecost Conference 2021, which had as its theme the mystery of the human being, on Rudolf Steiner's work, Christianity as a Mystical Fact and the Mysteries of Antiquity. And by the way, we just recently heard about this same theme and topic from Robert McDermott, did we not? And if you're interested and haven't seen it, Robert's recent lecture is available on the literaryarts.com website or on the Literary Arts YouTube channel. Now back to Ariana. She says, He was born in 1884 in Russia. His father was a colonel in the Russian army, and in accordance with tradition, his son also chose a military career, which he finally ended in 1896 as an officer at his own request, because his interests went in a completely different direction. And here is a quote that I found of particular interest to our work. Javlinsky said, "At the age of 16, in the summer of 1880, I was taken to the World's Fair in Moscow. When I came to a section exhibition of art, there were paintings, and for the first time in my life, I saw paintings. My soul had a profound moment of shock. Saul had become Paul. That was the turning point in my life. Since then, art has become my ideal, the holiest thing in my soul, and that for which my whole self longs." When Javlinsky moved to Zurich in 1917 and then to Ascona in 1918, he turned to the main theme of his life, the human face. He created the mystical heads. He said, "And then it was necessary for me to find a form for the face, since I had understood that great art should only be painted with religious feeling, and I could achieve this only in the human face. I understood that the artist must say with his art, through forms and colors, what is divine in him. That is why the work of art is a visible God, and art is a longing for God. In my view," says Javlinsky, "the face is not merely the face, but the whole cosmos. In the face, the whole cosmos is revealed." The article concludes, "Already paralyzed and heavily deformed by arthritis, Javlinsky painted by holding the brush with both hands. Like a modern icon, the dark tones of these intimate prayer-like meditations seem to be infused with an inner glow, brightened only occasionally by an accent of color." He died in 1941 after his long illness. Well, this concludes part 1 of the evening's presentation, under the sign Human. Part 2, The Dark Forest, follows directly, but it's also available as a separate video. Okay, having looked now in part 1 at the current issue of Stil and the themes that it contains, let's shift our focus to the book Art and Theory of Art and start to unpack these lectures by Rudolf Steiner. But let's take as the starting point for our discussion this diagram of Friedrich Hebel that Hebel shared many decades ago in 1966 in an essay about the section for the Literary Arts and Humanities. I took this diagram from an article titled The Origin of Fairy Tales. The article appeared in the 2002 yearbook of the section, published in English by the Goetheanum Press. And like the other things I mentioned tonight, I'll try to add this article to the website if I can, as time permits. Dr. Hebel's diagram is very interesting in many respects. Our eyes may at first be drawn to the items listed on the circumference of the circle. One of these is fairy tale studies, and the article takes this inclusion of fairy tale studies as a starting point for its discussion. But we also see other names, for example, mythology, art history, linguistics, 7 in all. And at the very center of the diagram sits poesia, or poetry. Now, the question arises, do these 7 faculties or disciplines radiate out from the center point of poesia, or do they contain the center point, poesia? And what is the relationship of poesia to these 7 points of the diagram, and who or what is poesia? How does wisdom, Sophia, and human, anthropos, relate to poesia and the 7 star points? And note that drama is included here in Dr. Hebel's section diagram. I'm glad to see that. So once again, is poetry a solar centering point or presence for these 7 planetary disciplines, poetics, aesthetics, mythology, etc.? Or, as the diagram might imply, do these 7 disciplines corral poetry and contain it? Or I might say, do they attempt to contain it or to explain it? Now, there are many ways to read this diagram, and that's what we do in literary studies, do we not? We propose various readings from various points of view, and we discuss and compare those readings. My reading tonight is derived from our section Ongoing Studies of Romanticism and poets we have discussed, such as, primarily for me at the moment, William Blake and Novalis. So, instead of reading poetry only as a solar point of centering focus, I propose that we see it also as a dark forest. Constructed about this dark forest is a fence with 7 little shacks where many little woodsmen and woodswomen live and keep watch over the forest, and they appreciate the forest. And they discuss it and praise it, each in his or her own way. One little shack is art history, and when we follow the picket fence down the tree line from art history on the trail, we come to another little shack called mythology. And from there, the picket fence takes us on a curving perimeter to linguistics, where we find some lively chatter and arguments going on in a very cozy shack, and so on, until we walk all the way around the dark forest, and we appreciate views of the dark forest from perspective of the marvelously situated 7 shacks, each with a spacious balcony and a view. Now, maybe one day, however, we get tired of walking in a circle around and around the dark forest from shack to shack, even though the trail is very pleasant, we have good company, and the shacks are all very cozy, and the conversation, oh my, and the food and beverage, very wonderful, and dinner always puts us to sleep. and we have amusing dreams. But maybe, I don't know, one day we get a little bold, or maybe frisky, or we hear a strange bird, or we meet a stranger coming out of the dark forest, or a weird old woman on the forest trail burns our book and smacks us and calls us dumbhead. Well, that happened in the Novalis fairy tale, Hyacinth and Rosebud, did it not? So instead of walking in circles around and around the dark forest and enjoying all those pleasant, worthy conversations in the 7 shacks, we decide one day to walk straight toward the dark forest and go into it. Now, as soon as we make this decision, all the woodsmen and all the woodswomen in the shacks, they show great concern. Many of them run after us and give us helpful maps or detailed instructions or advice, and food and plenty of water, and they warn us, oh, you'd better stay hydrated and keep your feet dry. But we thank them and we go on our way. And after a while, well, they go back to their shacks because, it's time for conversation and dinner. So we wave bye-bye and we set off. After a while, we come to a clearing at the edge of the dark forest. Now, the word for the clearing in German is Lichtung, by the way, and it's a word that the philosopher Heidegger likes to use. Maybe we can discuss this a little bit more someday, I don't know. Anyway, these clearings are quite enjoyable. They are more open and inviting than the shacks. In the clearing, you can taste and smell some of the mystery of the dark forest. The clearing is silent, and it's a bit magical and oddly bright, in contrast to the darkness of the forest. It feels uncanny, and yet strangely familiar. It feels strangely more like home than in the shacks, although at the same time it does feel a bit dangerous, as though we had trespassed on the master's land. One of these clearings, according to Dr. Hebel, is called epic, and one is called lyric, and one is called drama, and one is called essay. But there might be more clearings that Dr. Hebel didn't track. Sunlight enters these clearings, and we enjoy ourselves very much. It's a bit like fairyland, but the dark forest still lies ahead. Now, funny thing, we think that the 7 shacks and pleasant clearings and picket fence have circumscribed and contained this dark forest, or protected it maybe for its own good and for the greater good of humankind. But the funny thing is, as we get closer and closer to this dark forest, as we actually enter the dark forest known as poesia, and lose ourselves in it, we find that it is enchanted. And like the enchantments of modern physics, those black holes or wormholes, so-called, this dark forest appears to be a place, but it is really a point of entry to a vast unknown of being and time. What happens to us there in that dark forest? And how does this experience change our understanding of our map? At our next meeting, I'll go farther with these questions and speculations, and I'll say more about the contents of the recent book by SteinerBooks, and how these contents relate to our theme and to our journey into the dark forest. By the way, the very first essay in this book is one that we know quite well from the meetings. That is, Goethe as the founder of a new aesthetics. So you might want to review it or check out the meeting summaries that talk about our previous discussions of this essay, such, for example, as the meeting where we discussed Steiner's first address. we hear quite a bit about Rudolf Steiner's last address, where he emphasizes Novalis, do we not? But not so much about his first address, where he emphasizes Goethe and aesthetics. Goethe in the first address, Novalis in the last address, and between them we have anthroposophy. On that note, I will close tonight's presentation with a quotation from the beginning of the novel Heinrich von Ofterdingen by Novalis. This passage comes right after Heinrich has the famous dream of the blue flower. Now, we've discussed this dream many times at our meetings. Heinrich dreams of becoming a poet. The entire novel, Heinrich von Ofterdingen, actually, I think, can be read as Heinrich's journey, his journey toward poetry or poesia, or into that center point called poesia that I have described tonight as the dark forest. Now, that description, dark forest, might rub some people the wrong way, but I don't think it would have bothered Novalis, not on the basis of what we find in Heinrich von Ofterdingen or in the fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud, for example, or in many other places. The dream of the blue flower might be read as the dark forest calling to Heinrich, "You must change your life." But when Heinrich goes downstairs in excitement to tell his parents about his dream, well, his father serves up caution and good advice and tells young Henry to read his maps and do his lessons. Well, here's the quote from the book. Henry's mother went out. His father worked on industriously and said, "Dreams are froth. Let the learned think what they will of them, and you will do well to turn your attention from such useless and hurtful speculations. The times when heavenly visions were seen in dreams have long passed by, nor can we understand the state of mind which those chosen men of whom the Bible speaks enjoyed. Dreams, as well as other human affairs, must have been of a different nature then. In the age in which we live, there is no direct intercourse with heaven. Old histories and writings are now the only fountains from which we can draw, as far as is needful, a knowledge of the spiritual world. And instead of express revelations, the Holy Ghost now speaks to us immediately through the understandings of wise and sensible men, and by the lives and fate of those most distinguished for their piety. With all this in mind, you might want to re-experience the fairy tale Hyacinth and Rosebud by Novalis. You can watch a performance video of it on the website, narrated in English or in the original German. Well, that concludes tonight's meeting presentation. I'll pick up this theme again in future meetings this spring. Thank you for your attention.